Wyoming Territory, 1872. The land was a study in silence, a vast and lonely canvas painted in shades of ochre and sage. The wind, its only constant voice, whispered through the sparse grasses, carrying the scent of dust and distant pine. It was a place that demanded self-reliance, that carved solitude into the hearts of the men who dared to claim a piece of it. Elias Thorne understood this language of isolation better than most. It was a tongue he had learned through loss, a dialect of grief he had perfected in the years since the world had taken everything from him and left him with nothing but acreage and memory. His ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, a bulwark of hewn logs and determination against the endless sky. From the porch of his sturdy, unadorned house, he could see the distant ribbon of the Stagecoach road, a faint scar on the hide of the prairie. Most days it was empty. Most days, the silence was broken only by the lowing of his cattle or the sharp cry of a hawk circling overhead. He preferred it that way. The quiet was a balm, a thick blanket that muffled the echoes of laughter and a woman's soft humming that still haunted the empty rooms behind him. Attachments, he had learned in the cruelest way possible, were anchors that dragged a man down into the depths of sorrow. A man survived alone. It was the first and last commandment of his life. He stood now, leaning against a porch post that was warm from the afternoon sun, his eyes narrowed against the glare. He was a man shaped by the land itself, tall and lean, with the kind of hard-won strength that came from wrestling a life from unforgiving soil. His face was weathered, browned by sun and wind, and etched with lines that spoke of sorrows deeper than his 34 years should have allowed. His internal world was as ordered and stark as the landscape around him. He rose before the sun, worked until it bled below the horizon, and fell into an exhausted, dreamless sleep. It was a rhythm, a ritual, a way to keep the past at bay. A flicker of movement on the horizon drew his attention. It was not the familiar shape of a deer or a stray cow. It was a plume of dust, a deliberate and mechanical churning that spoke of wheels and horses moving at a steady pace. The weekly stage from Cheyenne. He felt a familiar, low-level annoyance. The stage was a disruption, a noisy, temporary intrusion that brought with it the scents and sounds of a world he had purposefully left behind. It meant a trip into the nearby town of Redemption Creek for supplies, an ordeal of polite nods and meaningless small talk he endured rather than enjoyed. Still, his coffee was running low, and the sack of flour was nearly empty. The world, it seemed, would not let him remain entirely alone. With a sigh that was more habit than expression of true weariness, he pushed himself off the post. The wood was solid and real beneath his calloused palm. Everything on this ranch was solid, real, and accountable only to him. His cattle, his home, the sturdy corral he had built with his own 2 hands. These were things that could not be taken from him by fever or fate. They were predictable. They were safe. He strode towards the barn, his long-legged gait eating up the ground. The scent of hay and leather enveloped him, a familiar comfort. He saddled his horse, a powerful buckskin named Stone, with an economy of motion that was born of endless repetition. He worked without thinking, his hands moving with a life of their own, but his mind was already turning over the list of supplies. Coffee, flour, salt, cartridges. Keep it simple. Get in, get out. Return to the silence. That was the plan. It was always the plan. The town of Redemption Creek was little more than a single dusty street flanked by a dozen wooden buildings, all of them looking as weary and sun-bleached as the bones of a long-dead buffalo. The general store, the saloon, the sheriff's office, and the stagecoach station were the town's 4 pillars, and around them clung a few smaller enterprises and homes. As Elias rode in, the stagecoach was already there, a hulking, mud-splattered beast standing before the station. The horses, lathered and breathing hard, were being unhitched by the station master, a wiry old man named Jedediah. Elias dismounted in front of the general store, looping Stone's reins around the hitching post. He gave the horse a final pat on the neck before turning towards the store, his gaze sweeping over the scene at the station out of ingrained habit. He catalogued the weary travelers stretching their legs, the freight being unloaded. It was all blessedly ordinary, until she appeared. She stepped down from the coach, and it was as if a figure from a different world had been set down in the middle of his. She was a splash of soft color and refined lines against the town's harsh, angular backdrop. Her dress was the deep blue of a twilight sky, impeccably tailored though creased and dusted from the long journey. A small, elegant hat was pinned to hair the color of spun honey, which had been coiled into a neat bun at the nape of her neck. She moved with a grace that seemed entirely out of place on the splintered boardwalk, her back straight, her chin held high, though he could see the faint tremor in her hands as she clutched a small reticule. He saw her scan the small crowd, her brow furrowed with a hopeful anxiety that slowly curdled into confusion, then dismay. The person she was expecting, it was clear, was not there. Elias felt an unwelcome flicker of something. Not pity, he refused to call it that, but a kind of detached recognition of her plight. She was alone, and this was no place for a woman like her to be alone. He quickly looked away, pushing the thought from his mind. It was not his concern. He had his own life to manage, his own ghosts to keep in their graves. He turned his back on the scene and pushed open the door to the general store, the jingle of the bell above the door announcing his arrival and sealing him, he hoped, away from the woman and her troubles. Clara Penhaligon took a steadying breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. The air tasted of dust and something wild and clean she could not name. It was so different from the cold-tinged air of Boston, the city she had left behind forever. For weeks, during the rattling, seemingly endless journey by train and then by stagecoach, she had held a single image in her mind, the kind, smiling faces of Mr. and Mistress Abernathy, welcoming her to their Wyoming home where she was to be governess to their 2 young daughters. The position, secured through a series of letters filled with warm promises, was her only lifeline. With her parents gone and the family home sold to pay their debts, she had nowhere else to go. But the platform was empty of any such welcoming party. She saw rough-looking men in dusty clothes, tired-looking women with sun-worn faces, and a few curious children who stared at her as if she were a creature from a storybook. There was no one who matched the descriptions in the letters. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of her composure. She clutched her reticule tighter, the letters from Mistress Abernathy inside, feeling suddenly like flimsy pieces of fiction. She approached the station master, Jedediah, who was wiping his hands on an oily rag. He had a kind, weathered face and eyes that had seen more than their share of arrivals and departures. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice sounding small and thin in the vast open space. "I'm looking for the Abernathy family. I was told they would be here to meet me." The old man stopped his work and looked at her, his expression a mixture of sympathy and regret. "The Abernathys? Oh, child, I am sorry. They are gone." The words struck her with a physical force, knocking the air from her lungs. "Gone? But that is impossible. I have letters. They hired me. They sent me passage money." She fumbled inside her reticule, her fingers trembling as she pulled out the folded correspondence. Jedediah shook his head slowly, his gaze gentle. "They sold their spread a couple of months back. Said they were heading for California. The man who bought them out, a fellow named Croft, he paid them well for it. They packed up and left in a hurry. Did not say a word about expecting anyone. The world seemed to tilt beneath Clara's feet. Deceived, stranded." The words echoed in the sudden, terrifying silence of her mind. She was thousands of miles from anything familiar, with only a few dollars to her name and a trunk full of books and dresses that were utterly useless in this rugged, unforgiving place. The hope that had sustained her for the entire journey collapsed, leaving a hollow ache of despair in its place. She stared blankly at the dusty street, at the strange, hard faces of the people passing by, and felt an overwhelming sense of being utterly, terrifyingly alone. She managed to faint, "Thank you," to the station master, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. She needed a moment to think, to regain some semblance of control. She turned away from the station, her mind racing, searching for a plan, any plan at all. As she stepped off the boardwalk, a sudden, powerful gust of wind swept down the street, kicking up a blinding cloud of dust and tugging at her hat. She reached up to secure it, but the unexpected force of the wind, combined with her emotional turmoil, made her misstep. Her ankle twisted, and she stumbled forward with a small cry, her arms flailing for balance. Before she could fall, strong hands caught her, closing around her upper arms with a firm, steadying grip. The touch was startling, a jolt of solid warmth through the fabric of her dress. She looked up, blinking dust from her eyes, and found herself looking into the sternest face she had ever seen. He was tall, his shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. His eyes, the color of a stormy gray sea, were narrowed, studying her with an unnerving intensity. It was the man she had noticed briefly before he had disappeared into the general store. Elias had heard her small cry. He had been on his way out of the store, his purchases bundled in a burlap sack, when he saw her stumble. Some instinct he had long thought buried, a protective urge he had no use for, surged without his permission. He moved before he thought, covering the distance between them in 2 long strides, and catching her before she could fall into the dirt. Clara's heart was hammering against her ribs, as much from the shock of the near fall as from the intensity of the stranger's gaze. She felt the strength in his hands, the solid, unyielding reality of him, and it was both terrifying and strangely reassuring. She found her voice, pulling herself upright and gently extracting her arms from his grip. "Yes, thank you. I am quite all right. It was just the wind." He gave a short, non-committal nod, his expression unreadable. His gaze flickered past her to the station, then back to her face. He had overheard her conversation with Jedediah. He knew she was stranded, and he could see the predators beginning to circle. A pair of rough-looking men who worked for Silas Croft were leaning against the saloon wall, watching her with greedy, speculative eyes. Elias felt a muscle tighten in his jaw. Redemption Creek could be a hard place for a woman on her own, especially one who looked like she was made of moonlight and fine porcelain. "You are the lady who is looking for the Abernethys," he stated. It was not a question. Clara's fragile composure wavered. "Yes. It seems I have been misinformed about my employment." She forced a detached, formal tone, a flimsy shield against the humiliation and fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Elias considered her for a long moment. The sensible thing to do was to walk away, to mount his horse and ride back to the quiet sanctuary of his ranch. Her problems were not his. He had enough of his own. But then he looked into her eyes again and saw not just fear, but a fierce, stubborn pride. He saw a woman trying to hold herself together when her world had just shattered like glass against stone. And he remembered another pair of eyes, clouded with fever and fear, and a promise he had made to himself over a fresh grave, that he would never again stand by and do nothing when he had the power to help. It was a promise he had not had to keep until now. The decision was made before he was even fully aware of making it. The words came out, clipped and practical, devoid of any warmth. "You cannot stay in town. The hotel is no better than a flop house. It is not safe." He paused, and the next words cost him more than he would ever admit. "I have a ranch, a few miles from here. I have a housekeeper, an older woman named Martha. You can stay there until the next stage passes through." Clara stared at him, stunned into silence. This severe, unsmiling man was offering her shelter? The offer was as unexpected as the gust of wind that had nearly sent her sprawling. Suspicion, a lesson learned from a childhood of reading cautionary tales, warred with the stark reality of her situation. She had nowhere else to go. The men leaning against the saloon were now watching them openly, their smirks making her skin crawl. She looked back at the stranger. His face was hard, but his eyes, for all their sternness, held no hint of deceit. They were direct, clear, and steady. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You do not know me. I know this town," he answered, his gaze flicking pointedly towards the men from the saloon. "It is not a kindness. It is a practical matter. My housekeeper will see to you." He made it sound like a business transaction, stripping the offer of any personal sentiment. It was safer that way, for both of them. Clara weighed her options. which were few and grim. She could remain here, at the mercy of men whose intentions were clearly dishonorable, or she could trust this solemn stranger who offered her a roof and the promise of a chaperone. She looked at his large, capable hands, the hands that had caught her so easily, and made her choice. I accept," she said, her voice gaining a fraction of its former strength. "And I thank you, Mr. Thorne," he supplied. "Elias Thorne." He gestured towards her luggage. "I will get your trunk." He moved with an unnerving efficiency, hefting her large trunk onto his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. He secured it to the back of his horse, along with his own supplies, before turning back to her. He offered her a hand up as she placed her small, gloved hand in his. His palm was rough and calloused, a map of hard labor, and it completely enveloped hers. He lifted her onto the saddle in front of him with an ease that left her breathless. Sitting so close to him was an intimacy that was both shocking and strangely comforting. She was pressed against his chest, the solid wall of him at her back. She could feel the warmth of his body, smell the clean, masculine scent of leather, soap, and sun-warmed cotton. As he swung himself up behind her, his arm came around her waist to hold the reins, effectively caging her in. The horse shifted beneath them, and she instinctively leaned back against him. He stiffened for a moment, a barely perceptible tension in the muscles of his chest, before he spurred the horse into a steady walk. They rode out of Redemption Creek without a backward glance. The dust swirled around them like golden phantoms, and a vast, silent landscape opened up before them. Clara felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she had been untethered from her own life and set adrift in a new, uncertain reality. Her fate, for the moment, was in the hands of this quiet, formidable man. And as the town disappeared behind them, swallowed by the immense prairie, she did not know whether to be terrified or relieved. The ride to the ranch was conducted in a profound silence. Elias did not speak, his attention seemingly fixed on the trail ahead. Clara, acutely aware of his physical presence, felt a storm of questions swirling in her mind but dared not voice them. The silence was not empty. It was heavy with unspoken thoughts, with the vastness of the land itself. She watched the landscape unfold, a panorama of rolling hills, dramatic rock formations, and a sky so wide and blue it seemed to go on forever. It was beautiful, but in a raw, untamed way that was both awe-inspiring and intimidating. It was a land that did not care for refinement or delicacy. It demanded strength. Finally, they crested a low rise, and she saw his ranch below. The log house was larger than she had expected, solid and unpretentious, with a wide porch and smoke curling from a stone chimney. A well-tended barn and a series of sturdy corrals completed the picture. It was an island of order in the midst of the wilderness, a testament to the will of the man who held her. As they drew closer, an older woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face was as stern as Elias's, her gaze sharp and assessing as she watched them approach. Elias reined in the horse and dismounted, then reached up to help Clara down. His hands were firm at her waist as he lifted her, and for a fleeting moment, her hands rested on his broad shoulders. The contact was brief, impersonal, yet it sent a strange flutter through her chest. He released her as soon as her feet touched the ground. "Martha, this is Mistress Penhaligon," he said, his tone flat and formal. She was expecting to take a position with the Abernethys. "They are gone. She will be staying with us until the next stage, east." Martha's sharp eyes raked over Clara from head to toe, taking in her fine dress and her pale, tired face. Clara felt herself flushing under the intense scrutiny. She looked like what she was, a helpless city woman, completely out of her element. But then, a flicker of something softened in the older woman's gaze. It might have been sympathy, or perhaps just the weary resignation of someone who had seen her share of hardship. "Well, get her inside, then," Martha said, her voice raspy but not unkind. "The girl looks half-starved and dead on her feet. The stew is hot." She turned and disappeared back into the house without another word. Elias grunted in what seemed to be agreement, and moved to untie Clara's trunk. Martha's cabin is just past the barn. She takes her meals here. She will look after you. He said it as a statement of fact, a reassurance that propriety would be maintained. He was drawing lines, setting boundaries. She was a temporary guest, a problem to be managed, nothing more. The inside of the house was as stark and masculine as its owner. The main room was large and open, dominated by a massive stone fireplace. The furniture was simple, handmade, and built to last. A long dining table stood in the center of the room, and a few shelves held a sparse collection of books. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and brewing coffee. It was clean and orderly, but it lacked any softening touch. There were no curtains on the windows, no pictures on the walls, no rugs on the polished floorboards. It was a house, not a home. It was a place for surviving, not for living. Over dinner, the silence from the ride persisted. Elias ate with a focused intensity, as if the meal were another task to be completed. Martha served them, moving with a quiet efficiency, her presence a formidable buffer between them. Clara, exhausted and emotionally drained, could only pick at the rich, savory beef stew. Finally, unable to bear the oppressive quiet any longer, she set down her fork. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice clearer than she expected, "I do not have the words to properly thank you. You have shown me a great kindness, and I promise I will not be a burden. I have some money. I can pay for my board." Elias looked up from his plate, his gray eyes meeting hers across the table. "Keep your money. You will need it for your ticket back east." His tone was dismissive, as if her gratitude was an inconvenience. "It is no trouble, but it is trouble," she insisted, a spark of her former spirit returning. "I have imposed upon you, and upon Martha. I am a stranger in your home." It was Martha who answered, placing a basket of freshly baked bread on the table. "The boy's right. It is no trouble. This house has been too quiet for too long." She gave Elias a pointed look, one he steadfastly ignored. The housekeeper's words hung in the air, hinting at a past sorrow that seemed to permeate the very walls of the house. Clara's gaze drifted around the room and settled on a small, exquisitely carved wooden rocking horse tucked away in a shadowed corner, covered in a thin layer of dust. It was a child's toy, made with love and care, now sitting abandoned and forgotten. The sight of it sent a pang of sadness through her, a sudden, intuitive understanding of the deep well of pain that lay behind Elias Thorne's stern facade. Later that evening, after Martha had shown her to a small, sparse guest room and left her with a pitcher of water, Clara sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was firm, the sheets clean and smelling of lye soap and sunshine. Through the open window, she could hear the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. The silence of the house was profound. She thought of her own past, of the warm, cluttered home she had lost, filled with books and music and the laughter of her parents. She thought of the future she had imagined for herself here in Wyoming, a future that had evaporated into dust. Tears she had held back all day finally began to fall, silent tracks of grief and fear tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. She was adrift, with no family, no home, and no prospects. Her life, once so ordered and predictable, had become a terrifying blank page. And in the middle of this desolation stood Elias Thorne, a man as hard and unyielding as the land he had tamed, a man who had offered her shelter even as he held himself at a careful, impenetrable distance. He was a puzzle she could not begin to solve, a fortress of solitude whose walls she instinctively knew were built around a foundation of profound loss. Downstairs, Elias sat by the dying fire, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The unfamiliar presence of a woman in his house was a profound disruption. He could hear the faint sound of her moving about in the room above, the soft creak of the floorboards. Each small sound was an intrusion, a reminder of a life he had locked away. He had seen where her gaze had fallen at dinner. The rocking horse. He had built it for his son, a boy with his mother's bright smile who had never lived to see his second birthday. The fever had taken him, and then his wife, Sarah, in the space of a single, brutal week 3 years ago. He took a long swallow of whiskey, the fiery liquid doing little to burn away the chill that lived permanently in his soul. Bringing Clara Penhaligon here had been a mistake. Her presence stirred things he had taken great pains to bury. Her scent, the soft cadence of her voice, the stubborn light in her eyes. It all reminded him of what he had lost, of the vulnerability that came with caring for another human being. He had built this solitary life as a defense, a way to ensure he would never feel that kind of pain again. But for the first time in 3 years, the walls of his fortress felt fragile, and the silence of the house no longer felt like peace. It felt like an aching, cavernous emptiness. The next few days fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Clara, determined not to be an idle guest, rose early and insisted on helping Martha. To the housekeeper's initial surprise and eventual approval, Clara was a quick learner. She kneaded bread with flour, dusting her fine dress, her movements becoming more confident each day. She learned to feed the chickens, her initial trepidation giving way to a quiet satisfaction. She mended Elias's work shirts by the fire in the evenings, her stitches small and neat, a silent act of gratitude. Elias watched her from a distance. He would see her in the yard, her honey-colored hair coming loose from its pins as she carried a bucket of water from the well, a determined set to her jaw. He saw her talking with Martha, a genuine smile lighting up her face, and he heard the sound of her soft laughter for the first time, a sound that was like a spring thaw in the frozen landscape of his house. He was both drawn to it and wary of it. He kept his interactions with her brief and practical, discussing the weather or the date of the next stagecoach, always maintaining a careful distance. He was discovering, to his consternation, that she was not the fragile creature he had first assumed. There was a core of steel beneath her refined exterior. She did not complain about the harshness of the life, the lack of amenities she must have been accustomed to. Instead, she adapted, her resilience like that of a wildflower finding a foothold in rocky soil. He began to respect her, and that, he knew, was dangerous. Respect was a step away from admiration, and admiration was perilously close to something else, something he had sworn off forever. One evening, as a cool breeze swept down from the mountains, they found themselves alone on the porch. Martha had retired to her cabin, and the sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Clara was sitting on the top step, her hands clasped around her knees, watching the spectacle. Elias stood leaning against the post, as was his habit, a silent sentinel. "It is beautiful," Clara said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "In Boston, the sky is a small patch of gray between the buildings. I never knew it could be so immense. It can be beautiful," Elias agreed, his voice a low rumble. "It can also be cruel. The land does not care if you live or die. It just is. Perhaps that is its appeal," she mused, turning her head to look up at him. "It is honest. It does not make false promises." Her words were laced with the bitterness of her own recent betrayal. An understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared disillusionment. He found himself wanting to know more about her, to understand the life she had left behind. "What will you do?" he asked, the question more direct than he had intended. "When you go back?" Clara sighed, her gaze returning to the darkening horizon. "I do not know. I have no family left. My parents passed away last winter. The house had to be sold. This position was everything. I suppose I will have to find another, though I do not know where to begin." She spoke of her losses with a quiet, dignified sadness that resonated with his own buried grief. He felt an unexpected urge to offer some comfort, an impulse so alien he did not know what to do with it. He settled for a clumsy, practical response. "You are educated. You could be a teacher, perhaps," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. She hugged her knees tighter. "My father was a professor of literature. He believed a woman's mind was a garden to be cultivated. He filled our house with books and ideas." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "He would be appalled to see me so helpless." "You are not helpless," Elias said, the words surprising him as much as they did her. He had seen her work, seen her adapt. "You are stronger than you think." Clara looked up at him, her eyes wide and luminous in the twilight. His unexpected praise was a balm to her wounded pride. In that moment, she saw past the stern exterior, past the walls he kept so carefully guarded. She saw a flicker of the man beneath, a man who recognized strength because he himself possessed it in abundance. And she saw the deep, abiding sorrow in his eyes. "And you, Mr. Thorne?" she asked gently, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "This ranch, this solitude, is this what you always wanted?" The question struck a nerve, and the mask of indifference slammed back into place. He looked away from her, his jaw tight. "It is what I have," he said, his voice flat and final. He pushed himself off the post. "It is getting late. You should go inside." He turned and walked back into the house without another word, leaving her alone with the vast, starry sky and the heavy silence he had left in his wake. Clara remained on the porch, a strange mix of hurt and understanding swirling within her. She had gotten too close, had touched upon the wound he kept so carefully hidden. She now knew, with absolute certainty, that the rocking horse in the corner was not just a piece of furniture. It was a tombstone. Her heart ached for him, for the pain he carried with such stoic grace. And she realized, with a startling jolt, that her feelings for this solitary man were growing into something more complex than simple gratitude. She was beginning to care for him. And in this harsh, unpredictable land, that felt like the most dangerous thing of all. The next time Elias went to town for supplies, a week later, the first signs of real trouble appeared. He had left Clara at the ranch with Martha, a decision that sat uneasily with him. Leaving her felt like leaving a part of his defenses behind. In Redemption Creek, he saw Silas Croft, the man who had bought out the Abernethys. Croft was a big man, running to fat, with a florid face and small, predatory eyes. He was holding court in front of the saloon with his foreman, a wiry, mean-looking man named Finn. As Elias passed, Croft called out to him, "Thorne, heard you took in some stray baggage from the last stagecoach." His voice was oily, his smile a sneer. His men chuckled. Elias stopped, turning slowly to face them. He did not rise to the bait. "What I do on my own land is my own business." Croft pushed himself off the saloon wall, stepping closer. He was trying to be intimidating, but Elias stood his ground, calm and immovable as a mountain. "Everything in this valley is my business," Croft said, his voice low and menacing. "Especially the water that runs through your land. I made you a fair offer for your ranch. You should have taken it. It was not for sale then," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And it is not for sale now. Everything is for sale, Thorne." "For the right price," Croft countered. He glanced over at Finn. And sometimes a man needs a little persuasion to see what is best for him. His eyes slid past Elias, a speculative gleam in them. A man with things to protect is a man with weaknesses. You would do well to remember that the veiled threat was unmistakable. Croft was not just talking about cattle or land. He was talking about Clara, a cold, protective fury, an emotion Elias had not felt in years, coiled in his gut. He held Croft's gaze, his own eyes turning to chips of ice. "You would do well to stay off my land, Croft, and to keep your men away from it." He turned his back on them and walked away, the weight of their eyes on him like a physical pressure. The confrontation had changed everything. Clara was no longer just a guest in his home. She was now perceived as his vulnerability, a pawn in Croft's greedy game. The thought of her being harmed because of him was intolerable. His solitary life had been a shield, but by letting her in, he had given his enemies a target. He rode home with a grim sense of urgency, the prairie's beauty lost on him. He found Clara near the creek that bordered his property, a small book in her hands. She had gathered a small bouquet of wildflowers and tucked them into her hair. She looked up as he approached, a bright, unguarded smile on her face. The sight of it, of her looking so peaceful and at home on his land, both warmed him and twisted his gut with a new, sharp fear. "Elias," she said, using his first name for the first time. "It sounded natural, right? I was just reading. It is so peaceful here." He dismounted, his face set in grim lines. He could not bring himself to return her smile. "It is not safe for you to be out here alone," he said, his tone harsher than he intended. Clara's smile faltered, confusion and hurt clouding her eyes. "What is it? What is wrong?" He did not want to frighten her, but he could not lie. "I ran into Silas Croft in town. He is the man who bought the Abernathy place. He wants my land. He wants the water from this creek." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "He knows you are here. He sees you as a way to pressure me." The color drained from her face. "Because of me? You are in danger because of me." The thought was horrifying to her. "We are in danger," he corrected her, the word we slipping out, binding them together in a way he had not intended. "His men are trouble. I do not want you leaving the house without me or Martha. Do you understand?" It was an order, born of fear for her safety. She nodded, her eyes wide. The peaceful sanctuary she had found had been violated, the threat of the outside world intruding with brutal force. "I'm so sorry, Elias," she whispered. "I never wanted to bring trouble to your door." "You did not," he said, his voice softening slightly as he saw her distress. He took a step closer, his hand lifting as if to touch her shoulder, before he caught himself and let it drop back to his side. "The trouble was already here. Croft has wanted this land since I bought it. You just changed his tactics." He looked at the book in her hands, at the flowers in her hair, at the life and light she had brought into his desolate world. And he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that he would do anything to protect her. The thought was no longer a matter of duty or principle. It was personal, deeply personal. The threat escalated just as Elias had feared. A few days later, one of his fences was cut, and a dozen head of cattle were driven off. It was a clear message from Croft. Elias spent a full day tracking the herd, eventually finding them scattered in a rocky canyon miles away. He returned to the ranch late, exhausted and angry, his clothes torn and his knuckles bruised from a fall. Clara was waiting up for him. She had kept his dinner warm on the stove and met him at the door with a basin of hot water and a clean cloth. She said nothing about his disheveled state, but her eyes were filled with a quiet, anxious concern. She gently took the cloth from him and began to clean a long scratch on his forearm, her touch light and careful. The simple, domestic act was unnervingly intimate. Her head was bent in concentration, a few loose strands of her honey-blonde hair brushing against his hand. He could smell the lavender scent of her soap, a fragrance that was now inextricably linked in his mind with her presence, with the slow, cautious reawakening of his own shuttered heart. He watched her slender fingers as they worked, and he had to fight the overwhelming urge to cover her hand with his own. "This has to stop," she said, her voice low and fierce. "You cannot keep fighting them alone. You should go to the sheriff. The sheriff is a good man, but he is old," Elias said, his voice weary. "And Croft has money. He buys his own justice. This is something I have to handle myself." "You mean we have to handle," she corrected him softly, looking up and meeting his gaze. Her eyes were resolute. "I'm not a damsel in a storybook, Elias. I will not sit by and watch you get hurt while I do nothing. This is my fight now, too." Her declaration of solidarity, her quiet courage, struck him more deeply than any physical blow. Sarah had been gentle and timid, a woman who had needed his protection from the harshness of the world. Clara was different. She stood beside him, not behind him. She was offering not just her support, but her strength. And in that moment, looking into her determined face, the last of his carefully constructed walls began to crumble. He was falling in love with her. The realization was as terrifying as it was undeniable. Loving someone meant you could lose them, and he did not think he could survive that again. The fear of losing her became a palpable thing, a cold knot in his stomach. It drove his next decision, a desperate attempt to protect her by pushing her away. The next morning, he was cold and distant, the brief warmth of the previous night gone as if it had never been. He found her by the corral, watching him as he worked with a new colt. "The stage is due in 2 days," he said abruptly, not looking at her. "I will take you into town. It is time for you to go back east." The words were like a slap. Clara stared at his rigid back, her heart sinking. "Go back," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. "But I thought—" "You thought what?" He cut in, his voice sharp. He turned to face her, his expression a mask of cold indifference. That you could stay here forever? This is no life for you, Clara. This is a hard, dangerous place. You belong back in Boston, with your books and your civilized world. My civilized world is gone, she retorted, her hurt turning to anger. There is nothing for me in Boston. I thought I was starting to build a life here. I thought we were. She trailed off, unable to say the words, unable to admit that she had allowed herself to hope for a future with him. We are nothing, he said, the lie tasting like poison in his mouth. Each word was a deliberate cruelty, a knife meant to sever the connection between them for her own good. You are a guest who has overstayed her welcome. I took you in out of sense of duty, nothing more. Now my duty is done. It is not safe for you here. Croft will use you against me. I cannot protect you if you stay. His final words, meant to be the final, logical argument, were his undoing. They revealed the truth he was trying so hard to conceal, that this was not about rejection, but about a desperate, misguided attempt at protection. Clara saw it in a flash of painful clarity. She saw the fear behind the coldness in his eyes. He was not pushing her away because he did not care. He was pushing her away because he cared too much. So that is it, she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. You're sending me away because you are afraid. You would rather be alone and miserable than risk letting someone into your life. You hide in your solitude and call it strength, but it is not. It is cowardice. Elias Thorne, her accusation hit him with the force of physical blow because it was true. He flinched, his mask cracking for a second, revealing the raw pain beneath. But he held his ground. Think what you will, he said, his voice hoarse. Be ready to leave in 2 days. He turned his back on her and walked away, each step feeling like he was walking on broken glass. He did not see the tears that streamed down her face, or the way she wrapped her arms around herself as if to hold her shattered heart together. He had done what he thought was necessary. He had saved her, and in doing so, he had plunged them both into a deeper misery than either had known before. The 2 days that followed were an exercise in silent agony. Clara moved through the house like a ghost, her face pale and her eyes shadowed. She packed her trunk with methodical slowness, each folded dress a final, painful farewell to the life she had briefly dreamed of. Martha watched the two of them with disapproving eyes, her lips pressed into a thin, grim line, but she said nothing. The air in the house was thick with unspoken words, with regret and heartbreak. Elias threw himself into his work with a frantic energy, trying to exhaust himself into numbness. But no amount of physical labor could silence the voice in his head that called him a fool and a coward. He saw Clara's heartbroken face every time he closed his eyes. He had protected her from Croft, but he had wounded her more deeply than any physical threat could have. He had taken her resilience, her hope, and crushed it under the weight of his own fear. The solitude he had once cherished now felt like a self-imposed prison sentence. On the evening before she was due to leave, the sky turned a bruised, ominous purple. The wind picked up, howling around the corners of the house like a tormented spirit. A storm was coming. It was a fitting backdrop for the tempest in their hearts. They ate their final dinner in a silence that was heavier and more painful than any before. Clara barely touched her food. Elias could not taste his. As dusk settled, deepening the shadows in the room, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the rising wind. It was not a single rider. It was several, approaching fast. Elias was on his feet in an instant, his hand going to the pistol he always wore at his hip. He moved to the window, peering cautiously through the edge of the glass. In the fading light, he could make out a half-dozen riders. Croft and his men. They were not waiting for him to bring Clara to town. They had decided to end things now, on their own terms. It is Croft, he said, his voice grim. They have come for the ranch. He turned to Clara, his eyes blazing with a fierce, protective light. The coldness was gone, replaced by a raw, urgent fear for her. Get to the cellar. Now, but Clara did not move. The woman who had wept with heartbreak was gone. In her place was a woman forged in the fire of her own resilience. Her eyes were clear, her expression resolute. No, she said, her voice steady and strong. I told you this is my fight, too. I am not hiding. Before he could argue, the first gunshot shattered the evening quiet, splintering the wood of the window frame. The siege had begun. Elias shoved Clara away from the window, his body shielding hers. Stay down, he roared. He moved to the fireplace, grabbing the rifle mounted above the mantel. He checked the load, his movements swift and sure. Martha, he yelled. The housekeeper appeared from the kitchen, her face grim but unafraid. She held an old, heavy shotgun in her hands. I am here, she said simply. Bar the back door, he commanded. Clara, keep the lamps extinguished. Do not give them a target. In the ensuing chaos, Clara found a strength she never knew she possessed. She was not a passive victim waiting to be rescued. She moved quickly through the house, dousing the lamps, plunging the room into near darkness, illuminated only by the flashes of gunfire from outside. She saw Elias take up a position by one window, Martha by another. They were outnumbered. A heavy blow shuddered against the front door, the sound of an axe biting into the thick wood. They were trying to break in. Elias fired his rifle, the boom echoing in the confined space, and a cry of pain answered from outside. But there were too many of them. Clara's mind raced. They needed an advantage, a diversion. Her eyes fell on the kitchen, on the large tin of kerosene for the lamps. An idea, desperate and dangerous, took root. She crept into the kitchen, her heart pounding. She grabbed the tin and a handful of rags from Martha's basket. Elias, she called out, her voice cutting through the din. He glanced back at her, his face a grim mask in the flickering light of the muzzle flashes. The side window, the one by the woodshed, they are not watching it. He understood immediately. It was a risk, a terrible risk, but it might be their only chance. He laid down a volley of covering fire towards the front of the house, drawing their attention. Go, he yelled. Clara did not hesitate. She ran to the small window at the side of the house, unlatched it, and slipped outside into the howling wind and darkness. The air was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. She stayed low, her body pressed against the rough log wall of the house, and crept towards the woodshed, which stood a short distance from the main house. The attackers were all focused on the front, their dark shapes illuminated by their own gunfire. She reached the woodshed, her hands shaking so badly she could barely uncap the kerosene tin. She soaked the rags, her mind a whirlwind of terror and determination. She knew what she had to do. With a prayer on her lips, she struck one of Martha's long kitchen matches against the rough wood of the shed. The flames sputtered in the wind, then caught. She touched it to the soaked rags. They erupted in a whoosh of flame. She threw the burning bundle onto the dry roof of the woodshed. The fire caught instantly, licking up the dry shingles, casting a sudden, brilliant, and chaotic light across the yard. Fire! One of Croft's men yelled in panic. The attack on the house faltered as they turned, confused, towards the new, unexpected threat. The diversion worked. It gave Elias the opening he needed. He fired with deadly accuracy into the disorganized group, and Martha's shotgun roared from the other window, adding to the chaos. In the confusion, Finn, Croft's foreman, saw Clara's silhouette against the flames. With a roar of rage, he broke from the others and charged towards her. Clara saw him coming, a hulking figure of pure menace, and her blood ran cold. She was trapped, with nowhere to run. But Elias had seen him too. With a guttural cry that was part rage, part terror for her, he abandoned his position at the window. He burst out the front door, firing his pistol as he ran, ignoring the risk to himself. He was a man possessed, driven by a single, primal need, to get to her. He met Finn halfway between the house and the burning shed. The two men collided with brutal force. The fight was savage and desperate. But Elias was not just fighting for his land anymore. He was fighting for the woman who had breached the fortress of his heart, for the future he had been too cowardly to claim. That love gave him a strength Finn could not match. He fought with the fury of a man who had already lost everything once and would rather die than lose it again. The fight ended with Finn on the ground and Elias standing over him, his chest heaving. The remaining men, Their leader down and their attack broken by the fire and the ferocity of the defense, lost their nerve. They scrambled for their horses and fled into the night, leaving Silas Croft, who had been directing the attack from a safe distance, to curse and flee with them. The yard was suddenly, shockingly silent, save for the crackling of the burning woodshed and the howling of the wind. Elias did not even glance at the retreating riders. He ran to Clara, his eyes wild with fear. He grabbed her arms, his hands shaking, and searched her face, her body, for any sign of injury. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice raw. "Clara, are you hurt?" "No," she whispered, her body trembling with reaction. "I am all right." He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him in an embrace that was fierce, desperate, and possessive. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in her scent, reassuring himself that she was real, that she was safe. The terror of nearly losing her had shattered the last of his defenses, laying his soul bare. "I was so afraid," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. The firelight danced in his stormy gray eyes, and in their depths she saw everything he had tried to hide, his fear, his pain, and a love so profound it stole her breath. "I was a fool, Clara," he said, his voice cracking. "A damned, stubborn fool. Sending you away, it was the hardest thing I have ever done. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just protecting myself. Hiding from the truth." "What truth?" she whispered, her heart aching with hope. "That my life ended 3 years ago," he confessed, the words pouring out of him now, a torrent of long-suppressed pain. "When I lost my wife and my son. This house, it was not a home. It was a tomb, and I was just a ghost, waiting to fade away. And then you came. You brought light and laughter back into these rooms. You made me feel again, and it terrified me." He took a shuddering breath. "I love you, Clara Penhaligon. I love your courage and your strength and the way you see the world. Pushing you away was like tearing out my own heart. I cannot live without you. I will not." Tears streamed down Clara's cheeks, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of a love that had weathered storms both internal and external. She raised a trembling hand to his face, her fingers tracing the harsh lines of his jaw. "Oh, Elias," she wept softly, "I love you too. I think I have from the very beginning." He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping to mingle with hers. He leaned down and captured her lips in a kiss that was not gentle or tentative. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of promises made and futures claimed in the fiery aftermath of battle. It was a seal on their shared survival, a declaration that from the ashes of their past sorrows, they would build a new life together. In the quiet that followed the storm of violence and confession, they stood together, watching the woodshed burn itself out under the first splatters of a coming rain. The immediate threat was gone, but the larger one, Croft, remained. Before dawn, Elias rode into town, not as a solitary rancher, but as a man with something precious to defend. He went straight to the sheriff's office, Clara's courageous stand having convinced him that he no longer had to face his battles alone. The old sheriff, galvanized by the evidence of a full-blown attack and the body of Finn left in Elias's yard, gathered a posse. The townsfolk, who had seen Croft's bullying tactics for months, were ready to stand with one of their own. They rode out to Croft's ranch and found him packing to flee. Faced with a united front, his power crumbled. Justice, for once in Redemption Creek, was swift. When Elias returned to the ranch, he found Clara and Martha sweeping up shattered glass and righting overturned furniture. The house was damaged, scarred by the fight, but it was no longer a tomb. It felt for the first time like a home, consecrated by their shared struggle and survival. Elias walked straight to Clara, ignoring the mess. He took her hands, his grip gentle but firm. His face was serious, his gray eyes clear and filled with a deep, unwavering emotion. "I have something to ask you," he said, his voice quiet but carrying through the room. He led her to the shadowed corner where the little wooden rocking horse sat. He knelt before it and reached into a small, hidden compartment he had carved into its base years ago. When he stood up, He held a small, velvet-worn box in his palm. He opened it. Inside, nestled on the faded lining, was a simple gold ring, holding a single, small pearl. "This was my grandmother's," he said, his voice thick. "She gave it to my mother, who gave it to Sarah." He paused, taking a breath. "I thought I would bury it with me. I never dared to hope I would have a reason to offer it to anyone again." He looked directly into Clara's eyes, his own shining with unshed tears. "Clara Penhaligon, you have brought me back to life. You have shown me that love is not a weakness, but the greatest strength a man can have. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you build a life with me here, in this valley?" Clara's heart felt as if it would burst. She looked from a ring to his earnest, hopeful face. This was her home. This man was her home. The life she had dreamed of had not vanished. It had simply taken a form she could never have imagined. "Yes," she whispered, tears of happiness blurring her vision. "Oh, Elias," yes, he slid the ring on her finger. It was a perfect fit. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, sealing his promise. Martha, standing in the doorway with a broom in her hand, allowed a rare, wide smile to grace her features. The house, she thought, would finally have the mistress it deserved. Their wedding was a small affair, held on the porch of the ranch house a month later. The entire town of Redemption Creek seemed to turn out. The men who had ridden with Elias against Croft came with their wives, bringing gifts of pies and preserves. Jedediah, the station master, stood as Elias's witness. The community that had once been a collection of strangers now felt like a family, forged in the wake of shared adversity. They rallied around the couple, helping to repair the house and rebuild the woodshed, their actions a testament to their acceptance and support. Clara, standing beside her husband, her hand tucked securely in the crook of his arm, had never felt so much a part of something. She had come to Wyoming seeking a position and had found a purpose. She had come seeking a house and had found a home. 1 year later, the Wyoming sun, gentler in the late afternoon, cast long shadows across the valley. The ranch was thriving. The herd had grown, the fences were strong, and a new, larger woodshed stood in the place of the one that had burned. The house itself had changed. Crisp white curtains, sewn by Clara, hung in the windows. A large bookshelf, built by Elias, stood against one wall, filled with her father's books and new ones they had ordered from back east. A colorful, hand-stitched quilt lay across the back of the sofa. The house was filled with light and life and love. Clara sat in a rocking chair on the porch, a new one, built for her by Elias, to sit beside his own. She was gently rocking, a soft humming sound coming from her lips. In her arms, swaddled in a soft blue blanket, slept their son, Daniel, named for her father. He was 3 months old, with a tuft of dark hair like his father's and a peaceful, sleeping face that was a perfect blend of them both. She looked out over the land, her land. The raw, intimidating wilderness she had first seen was now familiar and beloved. She knew the names of the wildflowers that grew by the creek, the calls of the birds that nested in the eaves of the barn. She was no longer a refined lady for Boston, but a woman of the West, strong and capable, her hands no longer soft but skilled in the arts of running a home and tending a garden. She had found a strength in herself she never knew she possessed, and a happiness she had never dared to dream of. She heard the familiar tread of his boots on the porch steps and looked up, a welcoming smile on her face. Elias stopped before her chair, his work for the day done. The harsh, solitary lines on his face had softened over the past year, erased by contentment and replaced by the gentle creases of frequent smiles. He looked down at his wife and his son, and a look of such profound love and wonder filled his eyes that it made Clara's heart ache with joy. He leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, then a feather-light one to the top of their son's head. He settled into the rocking chair beside her, letting out a contented sigh. For a few moments, they sat in comfortable silence, the only sounds the gentle creak of the chairs and the soft breathing of their baby. "I was thinking today," Elias said, his voice a low, warm rumble that was so different from the clipped, harsh tones he had used when they first met, "about the day you arrived. The stagecoach, The dust, the look on your face when Jedediah told you the Abernethys were gone. Clara smiled at the memory. I was terrified. I felt as if the world had opened up and swallowed me whole. He reached over and took her free hand, his callous thumb stroking the back of her knuckles, a familiar, comforting gesture. I remember thinking you were the most out-of-place thing I had ever seen. A porcelain doll in a dust storm. He shook his head, a small, self-deprecating smile playing on his lips. I was a fool. You were not the one who was lost. Clara, she turned to look at him, her heart full. No. His gray eyes, once stormy and distant, were now as clear and deep as a mountain lake. He met her gaze, and in his she saw her past, her present, and all of their promised tomorrows. No, he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet, absolute certainty that resonated in the depths of her soul. I never knew what home was until you arrived.